Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we travel backward through thousands of years into the ancient world of China, a civilization shaped by rivers, mountains, dynasties, silk roads, lantern light, and philosophies that still influence millions of people today, long before modern cities covered the landscape, before highways and electric lights, before trains crossed the countryside. Ancient China was a world of flowing rivers, mist-covered mountains, stone pathways, bamboo forests, and walled cities glowing softly beneath firelight. For much of history, most people in ancient China lived close to the land. Villages were often built beside rivers because water shaped nearly every aspect of survival. The Yellow River, sometimes called the cradle of Chinese civilization, helped support some of the earliest large settlements in the region. Its waters carried rich, fertile soil across northern plains, allowing crops to grow in areas that otherwise might have remained difficult to farm. But the river could also become dangerous. Floods sometimes destroyed villages, swept away crops, and reshaped entire regions. Ancient people living beside the Yellow River understood both its generosity and its power. Water gave life, but it could also take it away. And over many centuries, small farming communities gradually expanded into kingdoms. Then larger kingdoms became dynasties, and eventually, one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history began to emerge. The earliest Chinese dynasties existed so long ago that parts of their histories blend with legend. Stories passed down through generations described ancient rulers, floods, dragons, heavenly mandates, and wise kings bringing order to the land. Over time, these stories became woven together with real historical events, because in ancient China, history and mythology often existed side by side. The dragon itself became one of the most important symbols in Chinese culture. But unlike many Western dragons, Chinese dragons were not usually portrayed as purely destructive creatures. They symbolized power, wisdom, balance, storms, rivers, and heavenly energy. Ancient people sometimes associated dragons with rainfall and flowing water, a reflection, perhaps, of how important rivers and weather were to survival. And survival in ancient China required enormous organization, especially as populations grew. Farmers planted millet in northern regions, while rice became especially important farther south, where warmer, wetter climates allowed flooded rice fields to flourish. Rice cultivation required careful labor and coordination. Fields needed irrigation systems, water management, and seasonal planning. Entire communities often work together around agricultural cycles, and because farming shaped daily life, the rhythm of the seasons became deeply important. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvests, winter preparation. Life moved according to nature's patterns, not clocks, not screens, not constant artificial light, but sunlight, weather, rain, and the changing of seasons. For ordinary people, daily life often began very early. Before sunrise, villagers might already be preparing tools, tending animals, carrying water, or beginning work in the fields. The smell of smoke from cooking fires drifted through villages in the morning air. Simple meals were prepared from grains, vegetables, tea, and whatever foods were locally available. In many households, multiple generations lived together under the same roof. Grandparents, parents, children, and relatives often shared responsibilities within large family systems. Family relationships became one of the most important foundations of Chinese society. Respect for parents, elders, and ancestors was deeply valued, and this idea would later become especially important through the teachings of Confucius. Confucius was not a king, nor a warrior. He was a philosopher and teacher who lived more than 2,000 years ago. His ideas focused heavily on ethics, harmony, education, respect, responsibility, and proper relationships between people. He believed societies functioned best when individuals acted with virtue and care toward one another. Parents caring for children, children respecting parents, leaders acting wisely and morally. His teachings eventually influenced Chinese civilization for centuries. Even today, many of his ideas continue shaping cultural values across East Asia. But ancient China was never guided by only one philosophy. Another major tradition emerged through Daoism, a philosophy deeply connected to nature, balance, stillness, and harmony with the natural flow of life. Daoist thinkers often observed rivers, mountains, clouds, forests, and seasons when reflecting on existence, rather than forcing control over everything. Daoism emphasized moving with the natural current of life, like water flowing around stones in a river. This connection between philosophy and nature appeared constantly throughout Chinese art and poetry. Ancient landscape paintings often showed tiny human figures standing beneath enormous mountains. The scale itself carried meaning. Humans were part of nature, not separate from it. Mist drifting through mountains became symbols of mystery and contemplation. Rivers represented movement and time. Bamboo symbolized resilience because it bent in the wind without breaking, and in quiet temples or mountain retreats. Scholars sometimes spent years studying poetry, philosophy, calligraphy, astronomy, and history. Education became highly respected in Chinese civilization, especially during later dynasties. For some people, education offered a path into government service. Imperial officials were often selected through difficult examinations, testing knowledge of philosophy, literature, ethics, and classical texts. These examinations became famous for their difficulty. Students sometimes studied for years hoping to succeed. Entire lives could be shaped by the outcome. And because literacy was highly valued, calligraphy itself became an art form. Writing was not viewed merely as communication, but as expression. Brushstrokes carried emotion, discipline, personality, and balance. Scholars practiced for countless hours, learning to control ink and movement precisely. Even the act of writing could become meditative. Quiet rooms, paper scrolls, soft brush movements, rain tapping lightly outside. In many ways, ancient Chinese culture developed a deep appreciation for slowness and refinement. Tea ceremonies, poetry gatherings, garden design, music played softly on stringed instruments. Moments of stillness were often valued rather than avoided, and while emperors ruled vast territories, ordinary life for many people remained local and close to community. Markets became important centers of daily activity in towns and cities. Merchants sold silk, pottery, herbs, paper, spices, tea, tools, lanterns, and food from crowded stalls. The sounds of bargaining, footsteps, animals, and conversation filled narrow streets. At night, lantern light reflected softly against stone pathways and wooden buildings. Smoke drifted upward from cooking fires, and beyond city walls, the countryside stretched outward beneath moonlight. Rice fields reflecting the sky, bamboo forests moving gently in the wind, distant mountains fading into mist. While somewhere along ancient roads, travelers continued slowly onward through the vast world of China, beyond the villages and farming communities. Ancient China also contained enormous cities, places surrounded by walls, guard towers, markets, temples, palaces, and crowded streets filled with movement from sunrise until late into the night. Some of these cities became among the largest on Earth during their time, long before modern skyscrapers or electric lights. Tens or even hundreds of thousands of people lived together inside carefully organized urban centers. Roads stretched outward through gates guarded by soldiers. Messengers traveled between provinces carrying imperial orders. Caravans arrived with goods from distant regions. And throughout the empire, the authority of the emperor extended outward like ripples across water. The emperor was viewed as more than simply a political ruler. In many dynasties, he was considered the son of heaven, a figure believed to rule through something called the mandate of heaven. This idea became one of the most important political concepts in Chinese history. According to this belief, a ruler governed with heaven's approval only as long as he ruled wisely and justly. Natural disasters, famine, rebellion, or corruption could be interpreted as signs that heaven no longer supported the dynasty. And throughout Chinese history, dynasties repeatedly rose, flourished, weakened, and eventually collapsed, only to be replaced by new rulers. This cycle repeated over thousands of years. The Xia, the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, the Han, the Tang, the Song, the Ming. Dynasties emerging one after another across immense stretches of time. Some lasted centuries. Others collapsed quickly amid war or instability. Yet, despite political changes, many cultural traditions endured. Writing systems evolved, but remained connected to earlier forms. Philosophical ideas continued spreading across generations. Ancestor traditions remained deeply important. And daily life for ordinary people often changed more slowly than imperial politics above them. For farmers living in distant villages, the seasons still governed existence. Rainfall still determined harvests. Families still gathered for meals beneath lantern light. Children still learned stories passed down from grandparents. And in quieter moments, many people looked toward nature for meaning and perspective. Ancient Chinese civilization developed a profound relationship with the natural world. Mountains, especially, carried spiritual significance. Tall, mist-covered peaks became associated with wisdom, isolation, meditation, and immortality. Some Daoist sages retreated into mountains, seeking harmony far from political life. Temples were built into cliffsides and forests. Stone stairways wound upward through fog and pine trees. And in certain places, bells echoed softly through mountain valleys at dawn. Even today, many ancient Chinese paintings portray humans as extremely small within vast natural landscapes. A lone traveler crossing a bridge, a tiny fisherman beside a river, a scholar standing beneath enormous cliffs. The message was subtle but powerful. Nature was vast. Human life was temporary. And wisdom came partly from recognizing one's place within a much larger world. This feeling appeared often in Chinese poetry as well. Poets wrote about moonlight reflecting on rivers, autumn leaves drifting through mountain winds, distant flutes heard at night, snow falling quietly over villages. Many poems carried a sense of stillness and impermanence, a gentle awareness that all things eventually change. Dynasties fade, seasons pass, rivers continue flowing. The moon rises again, and while philosophy and art flourished, ancient China also became a center of remarkable technological innovation. Many inventions that transformed human civilization either originated there or were greatly advanced there. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. These developments eventually spread outward across the world. Before paper became common, writing often appeared on bamboo strips, silk, wood, or carved surfaces. But paper changed communication dramatically. Knowledge became easier to preserve and distribute. Books expanded. Scholarship spread more widely. And eventually, printing allowed texts to be reproduced in large numbers, centuries before printing presses transformed Europe. The compass also changed navigation. Originally connected partly to geomancy and spiritual ideas, magnetic compasses eventually became essential tools for travel and exploration. Gunpowder, first developed through experiments connected to alchemy, would later reshape warfare globally. And silk became one of China's most famous exports. For centuries, the methods used to produce silk were guarded carefully. Silk was lightweight, smooth, valuable, and highly desired across distant lands. Trade routes carrying silk and other goods eventually became known collectively as the Silk Road. Though it was not a single road, It was a vast network of trade routes connecting China with Central Asia, the Middle East, India, and even parts of Europe. Merchants crossed deserts, mountains, grasslands, and dangerous terrain, transporting goods across enormous distances. Camel caravans moved slowly through dry landscapes beneath open skies. Along these routes traveled not only silk and spices, but ideas, religions, technologies, languages, and stories. Buddhism itself spread into China partly through these trade networks. Originally emerging in India, Buddhist teachings gradually traveled eastward over centuries. Monks translated sacred texts, temples were built, and Buddhist philosophy became woven into Chinese spiritual life alongside Confucianism and Daoism. In some temples, large incense coils burned slowly overhead for days or even weeks. Soft smoke drifted through quiet halls. Statues of Buddhas sat peacefully beneath candlelight. Monks chanted rhythmically in low, steady voices. The atmosphere inside many temples was designed to encourage calm reflection. Even architecture reflected broader Chinese ideas about harmony and balance. Traditional buildings often emphasized symmetry, flowing roofs, courtyards, and alignment with natural surroundings. Gardens became carefully designed spaces meant not to dominate nature, but to cooperate with it. Water features, stones, trees, bridges, and open space were arranged intentionally. The goal was not perfection through control, but beauty through balance. And throughout the empire, daily life continued through countless small, ordinary routines. Children studied characters by candlelight. Vendors prepared steaming food in crowded markets. Families celebrated seasonal festivals. Musicians played traditional instruments during gatherings. Farmers repaired tools before winter. Travelers rested at roadside inns while lanterns flickered softly outside. At night, the world often became quieter than modern life allows. Without electric lighting, darkness arrived more completely. Moonlight mattered. Stars appeared brighter. Villages settled gradually into silence after sunset. The sound of insects, wind through bamboo, distant dogs barking, or rain against rooftops became more noticeable. And in wealthier households, scholars sometimes remained awake late into the night, reading poetry or practicing calligraphy beside oil lamps. Ink brushes moving slowly across paper, tea cooling beside them, soft silence filling the room. In many ways, ancient Chinese civilization developed around patience, patience in farming, patience in scholarship, patience in artistic mastery, patience in observing nature. Even many philosophies emphasized long-term harmony over immediate urgency. Rivers carved valleys slowly. Bamboo grew steadily. Dynasties rose and faded across centuries. And beneath all of it, the land itself remained. The rivers flowing onward, the mountains standing in mist, the moon reflecting across quiet water, while generations of human lives passed gently beneath the vastness of time. Beyond the great cities, beyond imperial courts and crowded marketplaces, much of ancient China remained deeply rural. Small villages stretched across river valleys, plains, hillsides, and terraced mountains. For ordinary families, life could be physically demanding. Planting rice by hand, carrying water, repairing roofs, feeding animals, cutting firewood before winter. Most labor depended directly on human effort. There were no engines, no electrical machines, no refrigeration, no modern transportation. The pace of life was slower, but survival often required constant work. And because weather shaped agriculture so heavily, people watched the skies carefully. Too little rain could destroy crops. Too much rain could flood entire regions. Drought, storms, frost, insects, or disease could threaten food supplies for entire communities. For this reason, ancient people often developed deep spiritual relationships with nature and seasonal cycles. Ceremonies were held for harvests, offerings made to ancestors, prayers spoken for rainfall and protection. The line between survival, spirituality, and the natural world was often very thin. And throughout Chinese history, ancestor reverence remained especially important. Many families believed the spirits of ancestors continued influencing the lives of the living. Homes sometimes contained ancestral tablets or shrines where offerings of incense, tea, or food were placed respectfully. Festivals honoring ancestors became deeply woven into family traditions. Remembering one's lineage mattered greatly because identity was often understood not only as the individual self, but as part of a continuous chain stretching backward through generations. This sense of continuity shaped Chinese society profoundly. Families preserved histories, names, customs, and obligations across long periods of time. Respect for elders carried enormous importance because older generations represented wisdom, sacrifice, and connection to the past. And in many ways, ancient Chinese civilization itself became deeply concerned with continuity. Dynasties rose and fell, yet rulers often looked backward toward earlier eras searching for wisdom. Scholars studied ancient texts written centuries before their own lifetimes. Calligraphers copied classical works repeatedly. Poets referenced older poems and histories. The past was not discarded easily. It remained present, alive within culture. And while some people lived quiet, rural lives, others experienced the vastness of the empire through travel. Roads and canals connected distant regions across enormous territories. The Grand Canal eventually became one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, stretching for over 1,000 miles. It connected northern and southern China through waterways used for transportation, trade, and communication. Grain shipments traveled along its routes. Officials moved between provinces. Boats drifted slowly through misty waterways, carrying goods beneath stone bridges. In some cities, canals replaced streets in certain districts. Wooden boats moved silently beside homes and marketplaces. Lanterns reflected across dark water at night. The sound of paddles and distant conversation echoed softly through narrow waterways. Water remained central to life everywhere. Rivers supported farming, transportation, trade, and entire cities. But rivers also inspired philosophy and metaphor. Daoist thinkers often compared life itself to water, flexible, patient, yielding, yet capable of reshaping stone over time. Water did not struggle against obstacles directly. It moved around them, flowed past them, adapted naturally. And this image became symbolic of harmony with the Tao, the natural way of existence. Some Daoist sages withdrew entirely from political society, choosing instead to live quietly in mountains or forests. There, they studied nature, meditated, wrote poetry, or practiced forms of breathing and movement, believed to cultivate balance and long life. Early traditions that would later influence practices like Tai Chi emerged, partly from these philosophical ideas. Slow, intentional movement, controlled breathing, stillness of mind, not power through force, but through balance. At the same time, Chinese medicine also developed through centuries of observation and philosophy. Ancient physicians believed health depended partly on balance within the body. Concepts such as yin and yang became central to understanding harmony. Yin and yang were not opposites in conflict, but complementary forces existing together. Dark and light, stillness and movement, cold and warmth, night and day. Balance between forces mattered more than absolute extremes. Herbal medicine, acupuncture, breathing practices, diet, and seasonal awareness all became important aspects of traditional healing systems. Some physicians spent years studying plants, minerals, pulse patterns, and the rhythms of the human body. Medicine itself became intertwined with broader philosophical understandings of nature and balance. And throughout the empire, festivals brought moments of celebration into ordinary life. During Lunar New Year, families gathered together. Homes were cleaned carefully, decorations placed around doorways, food prepared in large quantities. Firecrackers were believed to scare away harmful spirits. Lanterns glowed through crowded streets. Children received gifts and sweets. The atmosphere became filled with color, warmth, and reunion. The Lantern Festival marked the close of New Year celebrations with glowing lanterns drifting through the night. Dragon dances moved through cities, accompanied by drums and music. Moon festivals celebrated harvests beneath autumn skies. Families gathered to admire the full moon, eat mooncakes, and spend time together. The moon itself carried enormous symbolic importance throughout Chinese poetry and art. It represented distance, longing, memory, and shared experience. A traveler far from home could still look upward and know loved ones beneath the same moon were seeing it too. Many poems reflected this quiet, emotional feeling. Distance softened by moonlight, time passing gently beneath the sky. And while poetry and philosophy flourished, life in ancient China could also become turbulent and dangerous. Wars erupted between rival states. Rebellions sometimes spread across provinces. Invading forces entered from northern frontiers. Entire dynasties occasionally collapsed into chaos. During certain periods, China was divided into competing kingdoms fighting for control. Massive armies marched across landscapes carrying banners and bronze weapons. Fortifications expanded across northern regions. Over centuries, these defensive walls gradually evolved into what would later become known collectively as the Great Wall, though it was not built all at once. Different dynasties constructed and expanded sections over long periods of history. Workers carried stone, packed earth, and bricks across difficult terrain, Walls stretched over mountains and deserts. Watchtowers overlooked distant landscapes beneath changing skies. The scale itself became enormous, yet even structures as vast as the Great Wall remain temporary beside time. Dynasties faded, walls weathered, forests regrew, rivers changed course, and generations continued passing quietly through the centuries. Some born into wealth and education, others into hardship and labor. Most living ordinary human lives beneath the same moon, the same mountains, the same flowing rivers. Children growing older, parents aging, seasons returning again and again, until eventually their lives too became part of history, like lantern light briefly glowing in darkness before fading softly into the night. As centuries passed, ancient China continued changing in countless ways. New dynasties emerged, new cities expanded, trade routes shifted, and ideas traveled slowly across mountains and deserts. Yet, despite these changes, many aspects of daily life remained familiar across generations. A farmer rising before dawn, mist resting over rice fields, tea warming beside a cooking fire, children carrying water from nearby wells. The rhythm of ordinary life often moved more slowly than the rise and fall of empires. And perhaps nowhere was this contrast more visible than inside the imperial court itself. While villagers worked fields and merchants traveled dusty roads, emperors lived within enormous palace complexes protected by walls, gates, guards, and elaborate ceremonies. The Forbidden City in Beijing, constructed during the Ming Dynasty, would eventually become one of the most famous imperial centers in Chinese history. Its courtyards, golden rooftops, carved pillars, and ceremonial halls reflected immense political power. But life within imperial courts was also highly structured. Every movement, greeting, ceremony, and rank carried meaning. Officials wore robes indicating status. Court rituals followed strict traditions. Schedules revolved around governance, petitions, meetings, and ceremonial obligations. And despite all the grandeur, emperors themselves often lived under enormous pressure. The stability of vast territories depended partly upon their decisions. Floods, famines, rebellions, invasions, corruption. Any crisis could weaken the dynasty. Some emperors became remembered as wise and capable rulers. Others became symbols of excess isolation, or decline. Yet, regardless of the individual ruler, time continued moving steadily forward. Outside palace walls, the wider world carried on. Merchants opened market stalls at sunrise. Travelers crossed mountain roads with horses and carts. Scholars copied texts carefully by brushlight. Fishermen cast nets into rivers before dawn. And in quieter rural regions, life often remained deeply connected to nature. In southern China especially, terraced rice fields transformed entire mountainsides into layered green landscapes. These terraces were carved carefully into steep hills over generations. When filled with water, they reflected clouds and sky like mirrors. From a distance, some mountains appeared almost sculpted by human hands. The amount of labor required to maintain such landscapes was immense. Stone walls had to be repaired, water redirected, fields planted carefully by season. Entire communities cooperated around agricultural timing, and because rice farming depended so heavily on water management, the sound of flowing water became constant in many regions. Streams, irrigation channels, rainfall, flooded fields, water moving quietly through daily life. Tea also became deeply woven into Chinese culture over time. What began centuries earlier as a medicinal or practical drink gradually developed into something more refined and ceremonial. Tea houses became gathering places where people conversed, rested, listened to music, discussed poetry, or simply sat quietly together. Different teas were prepared with care and attention. Temperature mattered, timing mattered, the quality of water mattered. Even small, ordinary acts became opportunities for mindfulness and appreciation. This attention to subtle detail appeared throughout many aspects of Chinese artistic culture. Porcelain bowls, ink paintings, garden pathways, poetry. Beauty was often associated not with excess, but with restraint and balance. Empty space itself carried meaning. In Chinese landscape paintings, large portions of the scene were sometimes left intentionally open. Mist, sky, silence. The emptiness invited contemplation. The viewer's imagination completed what was not fully shown. This artistic philosophy differed greatly from traditions focused on filling every space with detail. Stillness itself became expressive, and perhaps this reflected broader philosophical ideas present throughout Chinese civilization. The understanding that not everything needed to be forced, explained, or controlled. That quietness contained value. That nature moved according to rhythms larger than human urgency. In mountain monasteries, Buddhist monks sometimes spent long periods meditating in silence. Temple bells echoed faintly through forests. Incense smoke drifted upward in still air. Snow accumulated quietly along stone paths during winter, and far below. Villages continued through ordinary cycles of work and family life. Children learned characters by repeating brushstrokes carefully again and again. Education required patience. The Chinese writing system itself became extraordinarily complex and beautiful. Rather than relying on alphabetic letters, written Chinese used characters representing words or ideas. Thousands of characters existed. Scholars might spend years mastering them. Brush technique mattered deeply. The pressure of the hand, the flow of ink, the balance of form. Calligraphy was not simply handwriting. It was considered an art reflecting discipline, character, and inner state of mind. Even today, ancient examples of Chinese calligraphy are studied almost like paintings, because within each brushstroke, people believed personality and spirit became visible. And while scholars and philosophers shaped intellectual life, craftsmen shaped the physical world around them. Woodworkers, potters, metalworkers, weavers, builders. Entire traditions of craftsmanship developed over centuries. Silk weaving became highly sophisticated. Porcelain production eventually created ceramics so refined that people across distant continents sought them eagerly. Lacquerware, jade carving, bronze casting, paper making. Skilled artisans transformed ordinary materials into objects of remarkable precision and beauty. Some workshops passed techniques down across generations within the same families. Knowledge preserved slowly over time. And while many people remained close to home throughout their lives, others traveled enormous distances across the empire. Messengers carried official communications between provinces. Soldiers guarded frontier regions. Merchants journeyed along Silk Road, networks through deserts and mountain passes. Travel itself could be exhausting and dangerous. Roads were uneven, weather unpredictable. Bandits sometimes attacked isolated travelers. Journeys that today require hours once required weeks or months. And because travel took so long, distance felt larger in the ancient world. A person leaving home might never return again. Letters travelled slowly. news spread gradually. The wider world often felt mysterious and distant. Yet, despite these limitations, Chinese civilization maintained remarkable continuity across long stretches of time, partly through bureaucracy, partly through shared writing systems, partly through philosophy and family traditions, and partly because memory itself became deeply valued. Histories were recorded carefully. Dynasties documented events. Scholars preserved texts. Families remembered ancestors. There was an awareness that human life was temporary, but culture could endure. A poem written centuries earlier might still be read beside lantern light. A philosophy spoken long ago might still guide daily conduct. A river flowing through ancient villages might continue flowing past modern cities. The world changed slowly, then suddenly, then slowly again. And through all of it, the mountains remained in mist. The moon returned each month above rivers and rooftops. Lanterns glowed softly during festivals. Rain fell across rice terraces. Temple bells echoed through forests, while generation after generation passed quietly beneath the vastness of time. As night settled across ancient China, the world often transformed into something quieter, slower, more reflective. Without electric lights filling the sky, darkness arrived fully. Villages dimmed beneath moonlight. Lanterns glowed softly behind paper windows. And beyond the edges of cities and farms, vast regions of mountains, forests, rivers, and open countryside disappeared into shadow. For many people, nighttime became a space for stories. Families gathered together after long days of labor. Meals were shared slowly. Tea steamed gently in ceramic cups. Grandparents told stories about ancestors, wandering spirits, dragons, immortals, ancient heroes, and distant dynasties. Children listened beside candlelight while wind moved softly outside. In a world without constant entertainment or noise, conversation itself became important. Memory became important. Stories carried history across generations, and throughout China, countless local legends developed around rivers, mountains, temples, forests, and strange natural places. Some mountains were believed to house immortals. Certain lakes were said to contain dragon spirits. Fox spirits appeared in stories as mysterious beings capable of transformation and illusion. Ancient trees, caves, bridges, and mist-covered valleys often became connected with folklore, because nature itself felt alive with meaning. Fog drifting through mountains, moonlight across still water, the distant sound of bamboo moving in the wind. These experiences shaped imagination deeply, and unlike many modern cities, the ancient world often contained long stretches of true silence, no engines, no distant highways, no electrical hum, only insects, water, wind, rain, footsteps, and occasional voices fading into the night. For travelers especially, the nighttime world could feel enormous. Imagine walking along a mountain road beneath lantern light. The path narrow beside cliffs and forests. Stars overhead, mist drifting between trees. Perhaps the sound of water somewhere below, and miles still remaining before the next village or inn. Inns along travel routes became important resting places. Merchants, scholars, officials, monks, and laborers sometimes gathered together temporarily beneath the same roof. Meals were served, horses rested. Stories were exchanged between strangers from distant provinces. Some travelers carried silk, medicines, tea, ceramics, or written messages. Others traveled for pilgrimage, military duty, trade, or government service. And because journeys were difficult, travel itself often transformed people. A person leaving one province might encounter entirely different accents, foods, customs, clothing styles, landscapes, and climates elsewhere within the empire. China's geography was immense and varied. Northern plains, southern jungles, high mountain ranges, deserts in the west, river valleys, cold northern grasslands. The environment changed dramatically across different regions, and so did daily life. In colder northern areas, people often relied more heavily on wheat and noodles. In southern regions, rice became central. Fishing communities along rivers and coasts developed differently from inland farming villages. Mountain communities adapted to steep terrain and isolation. Yet despite these differences, certain ideas connected much of Chinese civilization together. Family, education, harmony, respect for ancestors, balance between human life and the natural world, and perhaps because Chinese civilization endured across such long stretches of time, people developed a strong awareness of cycles, not only seasonal cycles, but historical ones, periods of peace followed by instability, dynasties rising and declining, prosperity followed by hardship, the idea that nothing remained fixed forever became deeply familiar. This awareness appeared constantly within philosophy and art. Cherry blossoms bloomed briefly before falling. Autumn leaves drifted into rivers. Snow melted. The moon waxed and waned. Human life itself became understood as part of a larger flowing process, temporary, yet connected. Daoist writings especially often encouraged simplicity. To live too aggressively against the natural rhythm of existence was believed to create imbalance. Water again became one of the most important metaphors, because water appeared soft, yet over time could wear away stone. It adapted without losing itself, moved without forcing, and ancient Chinese thinkers frequently observed nature carefully when reflecting on human life. Bird migration, bamboo bending in storms, clouds moving across mountains, river currents changing after rain. Nature was viewed not merely as scenery, but as teacher. Many scholars sought moments of solitude within nature to think clearly. Small pavilions were built beside lakes or high in mountain landscapes, places designed for quiet reflection. Poetry, painting, music, and philosophy often blended together rather than remaining separate disciplines. A person might write poetry while observing snowfall, play music beside a river, paint mountains partially hidden in mist, or sit silently drinking tea while listening to rainfall against rooftops. Stillness was not always viewed as emptiness. Sometimes it was viewed as understanding. And while the ancient world often appears peaceful from a distance, life could also be uncertain and fragile. Disease spread more easily without modern medicine. Famine could devastate populations after failed harvests. Floods destroyed homes. Political struggles caused suffering across entire regions. Most ordinary people possessed little control over larger historical events, yet daily life continued anyway. People married, raised children, worked fields, prepared meals, celebrated festivals, buried loved ones, and carried traditions forward, generation after generation. Some individuals became famous scholars or powerful rulers, but most ancient people lived quieter lives that history barely recorded. A farmer repairing tools beside lantern light, a mother braiding a child's hair before sleep, an old man practicing calligraphy in silence, boatmen drifting along canals before sunrise. Monks ringing temple bells in winter fog live small in scale perhaps, yet deeply human, and over centuries, those countless ordinary lives together formed the civilization itself, not only emperors and dynasties, but millions of individuals living through ordinary moments beneath changing skies. Sometimes, when modern people imagine the ancient world, they imagine only battles, palaces, and famous historical figures. But most of history was quieter than that. Most history was daily life, cooking fires, rainfall, conversations, footsteps on stone roads, the sound of brushes against paper, wind moving through bamboo forests, moonlight reflecting across still rivers at night. And perhaps that is part of why ancient China continues to feel so atmospheric and enduring in human imagination, because so much of its culture emphasized slowness, observation, reflection, and harmony with forces larger than oneself. Even now, many ancient temples still stand quietly among mountains, stone pathways worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, old trees continuing to grow beside courtyards, incense drifting upward through silent halls, while outside, rain falls softly across tiled rooftops, and somewhere beyond distant hills, a river still continues flowing through the landscape, as it has for thousands of years. Beyond the villages, beyond the rivers and mountain temples, ancient China also became a civilization deeply connected to time itself. Not time measured by digital clocks or schedules, but time observed through nature. The movement of stars, the changing moon, the arrival of rain, the return of migrating birds, the flowering of certain trees. For thousands of years, astronomy held enormous importance in Chinese civilization. Court astronomers carefully observed the heavens from towers and observatories. They recorded eclipses, comets, planetary movements, and unusual celestial events, because the sky was believed to reflect patterns connected to the earth below. An unexpected eclipse, a strange comet, or unusual changes in the heavens could sometimes be interpreted as signs concerning the emperor or the fate of the dynasty. The universe itself was viewed as interconnected. Heaven, earth, and humanity existing within the same larger order. And because agriculture depended so heavily on seasonal timing, accurate calendars became essential. Planting too early or too late could threaten survival. So, Generations of scholars studied celestial cycles carefully. Ancient Chinese astronomers created remarkably advanced observations for their time. They documented supernovas, tracked planetary motion, and developed complex calendar systems long before modern technology existed. Some records preserved by Chinese astronomers later became valuable even to modern scientists studying historical cosmic events. A star exploding hundreds of years ago, carefully described by someone standing beneath lantern light in the ancient world. The sky itself became part of recorded memory, and for ordinary people, the heavens often carried emotional meaning as well. The moon especially remained deeply important throughout Chinese culture. Its changing phases marked festivals and seasons. Poets wrote endlessly about moonlight. Families separated by distance looked upward at the same full moon and felt connected despite separation. One of the most famous themes in Chinese poetry became longing for home, a traveler resting far from family, watching moonlight spill across the floor beside a quiet window, a soldier stationed along distant frontiers, a scholar journeying between provinces. The moon became a symbol of shared experience across distance and time. And because travel in the ancient world required such effort, homesickness appeared often in literature. Mountains, rivers, villages, and familiar landscapes carried deep emotional meaning. A person might spend years away from home, traveling through official duties or trade. Roads stretched endlessly across changing terrain. In spring, wildflowers opened along hillsides. In summer, heavy rains turned pathways to mud. Autumn winds carried leaves across stone roads, and winter covered mountain passes in snow and silence. Travelers often moved according to the rhythm of the environment itself. At sunset, many roads became dangerous and difficult to navigate. Darkness in the ancient world was heavier than modern people often imagine. Without electric lights, night transformed landscapes completely. A mountain path by daylight became almost invisible after dark. Forests deepened into shadow. Rivers reflected moonlight faintly beneath mist. Lantern flames flickered in cold wind. And because so much of life depended on firelight, the glow of lanterns became woven deeply into the emotional atmosphere of ancient China. Paper lanterns hanging outside homes, red lanterns glowing during festivals, lantern reflections drifting across canals, soft orange light spilling onto stone streets at night. Even today, many people associate lantern light with calmness, memory, and quiet beauty. perhaps because it feels human in scale, gentle, warm, temporary, and throughout Chinese history, this appreciation for temporary beauty appeared again and again. A flower blooming briefly, snow falling silently, mist passing across mountains, tea steam disappearing into cold air. The awareness that moments fade made them more meaningful. This idea became especially strong within poetry. Chinese poets often wrote not about dramatic events, but about subtle experiences. Rain against bamboo, a boat disappearing into fog, crickets singing during autumn evenings, the loneliness of distant travel, the silence after snowfall. These quiet observations carried emotional depth because they reflected impermanence, everything changing slowly over time. And while some scholars sought peaceful lives of contemplation, others became deeply involved in politics and governance. The imperial bureaucracy grew increasingly sophisticated across certain dynasties. Government officials managed taxation, infrastructure, agriculture, law, trade, flood control, and communication across enormous territories. Maintaining such a large civilization required constant organization. Canals needed repair. Granaries needed management. Roads required maintenance. Flood defenses had to be reinforced. And throughout Chinese history, the relationship between human civilization and nature remained delicate. The Yellow River especially became both life-giving and dangerous, sometimes called China's sorrow. It flooded catastrophically during certain periods. Entire communities could disappear beneath water. Fields were buried in sediment, families displaced. The river changed course multiple times throughout history. Its movement reshaped regions repeatedly. And yet, despite destruction, people rebuilt again and again beside its waters, because rivers remained essential. The same water capable of destruction also supported agriculture and survival. This dual nature appeared often throughout Chinese philosophy. Balance, opposing forces existing together. Strength and softness. Creation and destruction. Stillness and movement. The natural world was rarely viewed as completely good or completely hostile. It simply existed according to larger patterns. And human wisdom involved learning to live within those patterns rather than imagining complete control over them. Perhaps this is partly why ancient Chinese philosophy still resonates with many people today. Modern life often emphasizes speed, productivity, urgency, and constant stimulation. But many ancient Chinese traditions emphasized something very different: patience, observation, harmony, the understanding that forcing everything aggressively can create imbalance, that silence can contain meaning, that slowing down may reveal things normally overlooked. Even tea preparation became a kind of quiet ritual. Water heating slowly, steam rising, hands moving carefully. The moment itself becoming more important than rushing toward the next one. And outside, the natural world continued moving gently onward. Rain falling through bamboo forests, riverboats drifting beneath bridges, mountain clouds forming and dissolving, birdsong at sunrise, temple bells echoing faintly through valleys, while generations of human beings passed through their brief lives beneath the vastness of sky and time, like lanterns glowing softly for a moment, before fading again into darkness. As ancient China continued through the centuries, people also became increasingly connected through art, music, and shared cultural traditions. Music held an important place in many aspects of life. Soft flutes, stringed instruments, bells, drums, and zithers were played during ceremonies, festivals, gatherings, and quiet moments of reflection. Some scholars believed music could influence harmony within both the individual and society itself. Gentle, balanced music was thought to calm the mind and encourage order. And in quieter settings, a single instrument played softly beside an open window could become part of the atmosphere of evening itself. Imagine a scholar sitting beside candlelight, rain falling softly outside, tea cooling slowly nearby, the sound of a guqin, an ancient stringed instrument, echoing quietly through the room. Beyond the window, mist drifting through dark bamboo. Moments like these appeared often in Chinese paintings and poetry because they represented an ideal of stillness and contemplation, not escape from life, but harmony within it. Gardens, too, became spaces designed for reflection, unlike gardens meant to appear perfectly controlled. Traditional Chinese gardens often attempted to recreate the feeling of natural landscapes in miniature. Small ponds reflected the sky. Stone pathways curved gently rather than moving in rigid straight lines. Trees leaned over water. Pavilions offered places to sit quietly and observe changing seasons. The sound of water moving through the garden became part of the experience itself. Everything was arranged carefully to create balance between openness and enclosure, movement and stillness. A person walking slowly through such a garden might encounter different views unfolding gradually. A bridge, partially hidden by trees, moonlight reflecting on dark water, the faint smell of rain or flowering plants carried through the air. These environments encouraged slowness, and perhaps because ancient Chinese civilization lasted across such immense stretches of time, many traditions became deeply refined through repetition over generations. Potters improved techniques passed down for centuries. Poets studied older poems before writing their own. Builders followed architectural principles developed long ago. Knowledge accumulated slowly, not through sudden acceleration, but through continuity. Even food traditions evolved gradually through regional history. Noodles in the north, rice dishes in the south, steamed buns, soups, dumplings, tea, vegetables, river fish. Meals were often shared communally, people gathering around the same table, passing dishes, speaking quietly together beneath lantern light. And while great dynasties eventually faded, many smaller human experiences endured. Parents teaching children, friends walking beside rivers, farmers watching changing weather, travelers pausing at roadside inns, monks sweeping temple courtyards before sunrise. The ordinary moments of life continued across generations, even while history changed around them. And over time, ancient China left a profound influence far beyond its borders. Paper, printing, porcelain, philosophy, poetry, architecture, medicine, tea culture, and artistic traditions spread outward into neighboring regions and eventually across the world. Yet perhaps the most enduring influence was less tangible, a way of viewing life itself, one that often emphasized balance over excess, patience over urgency, reflection over noise. The understanding that human beings are not separate from nature, but part of its larger rhythm, like rivers flowing toward the sea, like mist moving through mountains, like lantern light briefly glowing against the darkness before gently fading away. And tonight, somewhere across the mountains and rivers of ancient memory, temple bells still seem to echo faintly through the mist. Lanterns glow softly beside quiet canals. Rain falls lightly across tiled rooftops, and the ancient world drifts onward beneath moonlight. Slowly, peacefully, through the endless passing of time, as the centuries continued unfolding across ancient China, the relationship between people and the natural world remained deeply woven into everyday life. Even large cities could never fully separate themselves from nature. Spring rains still arrived. Summer heat settled over stone streets. Autumn winds carried leaves through palace courtyards. Winter snow softened rooftops and mountain paths alike. The seasons touched emperors and farmers equally. And because life moved according to these repeating cycles, many people developed a quieter awareness of time than exists in much of the modern world. There were long stretches of waiting in ancient life, waiting for rain, waiting for harvests, waiting for letters from distant family members, waiting for travelers to return, waiting through winters. The pace of communication itself was slower. News from distant provinces might require weeks or months to arrive. A person standing beside a river at sunset often knew very little about events occurring far beyond their region. The world felt larger then, not because the earth itself was larger, but because distance carried more silence between places, and perhaps because silence existed more naturally within daily life. People noticed smaller details more carefully. The sound of rain changing intensity during the night, the smell of pine forests after storms, the shape of moonlight on water, bird song before sunrise, snow accumulating gradually along temple roofs. Many ancient poems focused on these seemingly ordinary moments, not because life lacked larger events, but because quiet experiences were understood to contain meaning too. A person drinking tea alone while listening to distant thunder. A traveler crossing a bridge in evening fog. An old friend returning after many years away. A candle burning low beside unfinished calligraphy. These small moments became worthy of reflection, and over time, Chinese artistic traditions developed extraordinary sensitivity toward atmosphere and emotion. Painters often used ink in subtle gradients rather than bright, overwhelming color. Large, empty spaces represented mist, sky, distance, or silence. Mountains dissolved softly into clouds. Rivers disappeared beyond the edge of the painting. The world was portrayed not as rigid and fully defined, but as something shifting, temporary, and alive. This feeling appeared especially strongly during certain dynasties such as the Tang and Song periods, times when poetry, philosophy, painting, and scholarship flourished remarkably. Some historians later referred to parts of these eras as cultural golden ages. Cities expanded, trade increased, artistic achievement grew. Yet even during prosperous periods, many writers and thinkers remained aware of impermanence because history had already shown repeatedly that stability could change. Floods could come, wars could spread, dynasties could weaken, entire cities might eventually fade into memory, and perhaps this awareness gave Chinese philosophy much of its reflective quality. The understanding that nothing remains exactly the same forever, not sorrowfully, simply truthfully. A river continues flowing, yet the water within it constantly changes. Seasons return, yet no autumn is identical to the one before it. Human beings grow older quietly while hardly noticing day by day. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. And eventually, their stories pass into memory. This awareness of continuity through change appears again and again throughout Chinese thought, and nowhere was continuity more visible than within the landscape itself. Some mountains, visible in ancient paintings, still stand today. The same rivers continue moving toward the sea. Bamboo forests still bend in the wind as they did thousands of years ago. Moonlight still reflects across quiet lakes. Temple bells still echo through mountain valleys. The human world changes, yet the earth continues patiently onward. And throughout Chinese history, many people sought wisdom partly by withdrawing temporarily from crowded human activity. Scholars sometimes left official positions to live quietly in nature. Poets wandered mountains, searching for solitude. Monks meditated in remote temples surrounded by forests and mist. To step away from noise and ambition was sometimes viewed not as failure, but clarity, a chance to see life more simply. In some mountain monasteries, days passed through slow routines, sweeping courtyards, lighting incense, preparing tea, copying texts carefully by hand, listening to rainfall, meditating in silence. The world beyond the mountains might be filled with politics, conflict, trade, and urgency. But within those quiet spaces, time moved differently, slower, gentler, more attentive. And perhaps this contrast between activity and stillness became one of the defining balances within Chinese civilization itself. Great cities and remote mountains, imperial courts and quiet temples, crowded markets and silent forests, ambition and reflection existing side by side. Even today, many people continue feeling drawn toward these ancient images. Lanterns glowing in rain, mountain paths disappearing into mist, wooden boats drifting beneath stone bridges, snow falling across temple rooftops, because such images suggest something modern life often lacks: space to breathe, space to observe, space to exist without constant urgency. And yet, ancient life itself was never completely peaceful. People still experienced grief, illness, uncertainty, aging, and loss. Parents worried for children. Families struggled through poor harvests. Wars displaced entire communities. Loved ones separated by travel or political duty sometimes never saw each other again. Human emotion has changed very little across history. People thousands of years ago still hoped, feared, loved, mourned, and searched for meaning much as humans do now. A scholar staring at moonlight beside an oil lamp, a farmer watching storm clouds gather over fields, a traveler feeling lonely, far from home. These emotions remain understandable even across centuries. And perhaps this is part of what makes the ancient world feel strangely close despite its distance in time. Beneath differences in technology or clothing, human experience itself remains deeply familiar. The need for belonging, for peace, for understanding, for moments of quiet beauty within uncertain lives. And through all of it, the natural world continued surrounding ancient China endlessly. Rain moving across rice terraces, riverboats drifting slowly through morning fog, cicadas singing during summer evenings, wind through pine trees high in the mountains, lantern reflections trembling softly in dark water, the sound of distant bells fading into mist, while generation after generation lived their brief lives beneath the same moonlit sky, until eventually becoming part of the long, flowing memory of history itself. And so, as centuries slowly passed across the landscape of ancient China, the world continued changing one quiet generation at a time. Children grew older beside rivers and rice fields. Lanterns were lit each evening as darkness settled over villages. Rain returned each spring to the mountains, and the moon continued rising above tiled rooftops, just as it had for countless lives before. Dynasties rose with great ambition. Palaces expanded. Roads stretched farther across the empire. Trade routes carried silk and tea across deserts and mountain passes. Scholars filled libraries with poetry and philosophy. Temples echoed with chants, drifting softly through incense smoke. Yet eventually, every dynasty faded. Every emperor passed into history. Even great walls weathered slowly beneath wind and rain, because time moves gently across all things, like water flowing patiently around stone. And perhaps the people of ancient China understood this more deeply than many civilizations. The understanding that permanence is often an illusion. That strength alone cannot stop change. That harmony sometimes matters more than control. The bamboo bends during storms, yet survives. The river changes course, yet continues flowing. The moon disappears each month, yet always returns again. And in quiet moments, many ancient thinkers believed wisdom came not from conquering life, but from observing it carefully, listening, watching, moving with its rhythms rather than against them. Perhaps that is why so much of ancient Chinese culture feels calm, even across thousands of years. Because beneath the wars, the politics, the dynasties, and the enormous changes of history, there remained a constant awareness of stillness, tea steaming beside a window during rainfall, a fisherman drifting silently across morning water, temple bells sounding faintly through mountain mist, ink drying slowly on paper while candlelight flickered nearby. Simple moments becoming meaningful because they were temporary, and tonight, far beyond the modern world, beyond highways, screens, traffic, and electric light, the ancient landscape still seems to exist somewhere in memory. A river moving quietly beneath moonlight, stone bridges arching over dark canals, lanterns glowing softly beside narrow streets, bamboo forests swaying in cool night wind, distant mountains fading into silver mist. Perhaps somewhere high in those mountains, a temple still rests silently among pine trees. Snow gathered softly along old rooftops, incense drifting upward through still air. Monks moving quietly through dim corridors before dawn. The sound of water echoing faintly among stone pathways. And below, in villages resting beside the rivers, families settle into sleep beneath paper lantern light. Cooking fires fade slowly into embers. Wooden doors close softly against the cold night air. The world grows quieter. A boat drifts gently through dark water beneath the stars, its reflection trembling softly beside the moon. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays briefly in the night, then fades again into silence. Clouds move slowly across the mountains. Rain begins lightly against bamboo leaves. The river continues onward through darkness, just as it has for thousands of years. past forgotten villages, past ancient temples, past generations of lives now long vanished into history, still flowing patiently toward the sea. And above it all, the moon hangs quietly over the ancient world, silver light resting across rooftops, across forests, across canals and distant hills. The same moon once watched by scholars writing poetry beside candlelight, by travelers crossing mountain roads, by farmers standing silently in flooded rice fields beneath the stars, by children listening to stories beside warm lanterns before sleep, their lives brief, yet connected across time, like small lights glowing softly for a while in the darkness, before gently fading. And now, the roads grow empty, the lanterns dim. Mist settles low across the rivers and valleys. The mountains disappear slowly into the night. Only the quiet sounds remain. Rain against rooftops, water moving gently through canals, wind drifting through bamboo. A distant bell echoing softly once more through the fog, then quieter still, until even the river itself seems far away, flowing endlessly through darkness beneath the sleeping world, unhurried, ancient, peaceful,